Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I am your host Tony, and today we're going to look at King's Quest V, a point-and-click adventure title developed and published by Sierra Online for various computer platforms in 1990, including MS-DOS, Windows, Mac, and Amiga, with a port to the Nintendo Entertainment System following in 1992. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 131. I'm excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well, because this is another special episode. It is another Patreon-sponsored episode. This one is sponsored by ISO. ISO did record a message for all of us to listen to. So ISO, take it away.
Have you previously played King's Quest V?
What a nice day to be walking through the woods. Is that a castle I see over there? Holy hell, what's that owl doing?
Woohoo! Anyway, where was I? Oh, yes.
Oh, it's you, Cedric. Looks like you've been on one of your cocaine binges again. What happened to the king's castle?
My castle? What has happened?
I know, mate. What's going on? This bloody owl.
Ooh, I can tell you what happened.
Don't stop now. Go on.
Ooh, it was the powerful and evil wizard Mordak who did it. Ooh, I just happened to be visiting with an old friend when I saw him materialize out of thin air. Thank goodness he didn't notice me.
Mate, there was no Mordak. You were just high on cocaine cooking your pot full of whatever the hell this is.
The stuff boiling in the pot doesn't look or smell very appetizing.
That I don't know. Ooh, I only know that it was Mordak who took your castle and your family.
Why? Why would this wizard, Mordak, want my castle? What could he have against me and my family?
Sounds to me like some Class A bull.
Well, it is my opinion that you don't stand a chance against the likes of Mordak.
Whoa. I don't see you coming up with any great ideas to saving Graham's castle.
Well, perhaps I can help you. My employer also happens to be a wizard, which is why I recognized Mordak. Ooh, unlike Mordak, though, my employer is a very good wizard. His name is Crispin Arthur, but we all call him Crispin for short. The only problem is, you see...
Crispin Glover? Isn't that the dad from Back to the Future?
You can follow me to the land of Serenia, where Crispin and I live. It's much too far to walk, you know. Ooh, I think the fairy dust is still good.
What is that stuff? I don't know. This doesn't sound as if it would work.
Ooh, it'll help you to fly.
I don't know about you, Graham, but I'm just gonna take some of this crazy owl's magic cocaine dust and see if it gets us any further in the story.
Oh my.
Follow me!
Okay, here I come!
Whoa.
Ooh, looks like the fairy dust just wore off.
Do you really want to quit?
That was my one-man play, Abstinence Makes the Heart Grow Longer, a tribute to King's Quest V. Special thank you to my brother for sorting out the audio clips for that, and all of you for listening to that garbage. So now that I've probably alienated about 95% of the audience for this episode, I'd like to explain why I've picked King's Quest V as my sponsor episode. This game's one of my earliest memories of gaming. I can remember pretty vividly playing games before this, but this one was the first one that I remember being sort of playing it by myself and being completely overwhelmed by it. It had full audio. I mean, I don't know if you could like comprehend that nowadays, but like full audio of this annoying owl and like the announcer, and that's sort of the reason I wanted to do that little skit at the start, because the music and sound of this game is just embedded into my memory. I know a lot of people have got the announcer saying life-giving water from the desert scene as their that one key thing, or poisonous snake from Cedric. But yeah, practically like everything in this like is a memory trigger. Not sure if I've actually sat down and played this all the way through. I have a seeking suspicion that it's not worth it, but Tony will soon enlighten us. The other part that makes this game so special is just the ridiculous difficulty. It's a Sierra trope, but the difficulty and deaths in this game is worth just going through to experience all of them. As I said, the experience of me playing this as a child was, from my memory, getting locked in a basement by some thugs, dying, starting again, getting bitten by a snake, dying, starting again, getting killed by bandits, dying, starting again. And what was the last one? Oh yeah, there was like a gypsy, and the gypsy just punched me, and that was the end. So if you'd like to experience this and more, please download King's Quest V, and you can direct all hate mail to Roberta Williams. Last thing I wanted to say while I've got the mic is I'd like to thank the Discord again, and also a little shout out to a different Discord and a different channel. I know that's probably sacrilege, but I'm going to try doing it anyway. One Short Eye on YouTube, and Discord. Might be able to put a link in the show notes. His channel is fantastic. He does a lot of documentaries on speedrunning of classic adventure games, mostly Sierra, but there's also some LucasArts stuff. It's riveting. I wouldn't be able to do any of the stuff that he does, or any of the people that do the speedrunning, but just the history of it is fantastic and really, really riveting. So shout out to him, and yeah, he's got the same sort of style as Tony, a lot of funny interjections, and it's just really informative. So please check that out and enjoy the episode on King's Quest V.
Thank you, ISO, for your message, your sponsorship, and your support. If you would like to sponsor an episode or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun on our Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, rewards, discussions, and polls to determine future episodes. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo review kind of section. And I say pseudo review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics, how does the game look, the sound and music, how does the game sound, the narrative and or story, if the game has one, Playability and controls and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the pantheon of classic gaming. If a game reaches the pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite pantheon level, but they're still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go. But I can't recommend these games to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is King's Quest V. King's Quest V is a point-and-click adventure title developed and published by Sierra Online for various computer platforms in 1990, with an eventual port to the Nintendo Entertainment System following in 1992. Before we can talk about King's Quest V, we need to take a step back and talk about the creation of the King's Quest series in general, a discussion we covered in depth back around a half a year ago during episode 107. While we're not going to cover every aspect of King's Quest's original creation today, it is important to understand that earlier effort as well as its immediate successors, because, as we'll soon talk about, King's Quest V represented a dramatic shift in both the King's Quest as well as Sierra adventure game formula. And in order to understand why that was such a big deal, we need to understand where things started. So let's talk about King's Quest, the landmark 1984 adventure title that served to really put Sierra Online on the map, and would also mark the first entry in the well-respected King's Quest series of adventure titles. King's Quest was conceived by legendary game designer Roberta Williams, whose husband Ken Williams had founded a company called Online Systems back in 1979 as a means to work on and eventually distribute a port of the popular Fortran programming language to the Apple II computer platform. Back in the late 70s, there were a number of different programming languages vying for the attention of the rapidly expanding software development community, and on the Apple II, the de facto standard programming language of the time was BASIC, a relatively simple to understand language that allowed for higher level natural language code to be written, as opposed to the more hardware-centric assembly language programming that true hardcore developers were apt to study. Ken looked at BASIC's dominance of the Apple II development scene and considered that if he was able to port Fortran, another popular software development language, to the Apple II, then he might be able to break into the market, steal some market share from BASIC, and hopefully make some money in the process. While Ken was undeniably focused on business software, he also maintained general awareness of the broader computer industry, which is why, when a brand new game began to make the rounds on the Apple II, Will Crowther's Adventure, or Colossal Cave Adventure, depending on which version of the game you were looking at, Ken's curiosity was piqued. At the time, he didn't have a particular interest in playing a new game, though he did consider that his stay-at-home wife, Roberta, might be able to have some fun with the game as a potential diversion from the traditional wife and mother duties that she had been focused on up to that point. Ken returned home one evening and handed the game to Roberta, and though she wasn't exactly sure what to expect, she figured, what the heck, why not give it a try? So, she put the disc in her Apple II, fired up the game, and then her entire world changed. Roberta became enamored with adventure, so much so that she effectively spent every waking hour, and then some, attempting to figure out how to solve all of the game's puzzles, uncover all of its secrets, and avoid every single one of its traps, all in the hopes of beating the game and achieving the sense of accomplishment that all adventure gamers seek out even today. The interesting thing here, though, is that back when Roberta Williams was playing Adventure, there really wasn't even a group of people called adventure gamers just yet, because Will Crowther's Adventure was effectively the grandfather of the entire adventure game genre. Sure, other adventure titles, which at the time meant text-based adventures, were beginning to make their way to market, but the genre as a whole was still very much in its infancy stages. Despite the general lack of structure around the adventure game genre, Roberta considered that perhaps she could contribute to the overall advancement of the genre herself. In fact, she was so inspired by playing adventure that she decided pretty much on the spot to develop her own adventure game, to hopefully give other players the same feeling of wonder and awe that she felt during her first playthrough of Adventure. There was only one issue. Roberta Williams was not really all that tech savvy, or at least she didn't know how in the heck she'd be able to develop an adventure game. She knew that she could come up with ideas for a story and puzzles for players to solve, but actually making a game? That was beyond her current skill set. Luckily for her, though, her husband Ken was an incredibly talented software developer, and he agreed to help Roberta turn her game concept into reality. Ken figured he could provide the development know-how, Roberta could provide the game design, and together, the duo could make something that both hoped would be a title other interested gamers would enjoy. While Ken was 100% supportive of his wife's efforts, he did have one condition that his assistance was contingent on. Ken Williams, even from this stage in his career, was interested in doing things unlike other people, and in particular, he wanted anything he worked on to have a certain wow factor for anyone who might try to use it. So, rather than create a purely text-driven adventure, as was the norm for the time, he wanted instead to add graphics to the experience, to create a visual experience that had truly never been seen before. That goal, along with Roberta Williams' own design, is what would form the foundation for Online Systems' very first game, the graphical adventure title Mystery House. As the first adventure title ever created to marry text with graphics, Mystery House would become a major influence on the adventure game genre, and would serve as the foundation for every one of Online Systems' next games, all of which would be branded as the quote-unquote high-res adventure series, a marketing ploy meant to symbolize just how advanced the company's games were in comparison to its competition. While the high-res adventure series would grow to include 7 games between 1980 and 1983, an agreement with IBM to develop a brand new cutting-edge adventure title for their forthcoming PC Junior platform would give Online Systems, which at this point had been rechristened as Sierra Online, an opportunity to deliver an experience that would be designed from the ground up to dramatically surpass the capabilities of the high-res adventures that had, up to this point, represented the company's flagship titles. This new game would feature an on-screen avatar that players could use to navigate around the expansive in-game world, a departure from the first-person perspective adventures that Sierra had been known for up to that point, and would also feature advanced graphics, puzzles that could be solved in any number of ways, and an upgraded text parser that would be able to recognize and respond to many more user commands and inputs than what prior titles had ever been capable of. As Roberta Williams sat down to design this new game, and Sierra's software engineers collaborated on the creation of a brand new engine to bring this new game to life, the feeling across the company was one of anxious optimism. They were effectively putting a ton of eggs into this one advanced adventure game-sized basket, and Ken, Roberta, and the rest of the Sierra team really hoped that this new title would be a big hit. Eventually, work on that game would complete, and the very first King's Quest title would be released on the IBM PC Junior computer platform in 1984. Unfortunately for all involved, initial sales for King's Quest were much lower than anticipated, and given the fact that the game was so advanced that it could basically only run on the IBM PC Junior since other computers of the time didn't have equivalent capabilities, Sierra was in a bit of a challenging position, and in fact was dangerously close to having to shut down the studio due to low financial performance. Luckily for them, and for all of us adventure gamers, Sierra's fortunes would turn around as new computer platforms made their way to the market, many of which had capabilities that could in fact meet King's Quest's system requirements. This allowed Sierra to port the game to a number of different platforms, and in the process, King's Quest would become a commercial success, as well as a beloved title amongst a huge number of adventure gamers. King's Quest represented one of the most advanced adventure titles that had ever been released up to that point, a true tour de force that showed once again that Sierra Online was an adventure game development studio that very few companies could hope to compete with. A large reason for Sierra's success around this time was, of course, the designers that they employed, with Roberta Williams maintaining a position of prominence amongst the design team, primarily because of her past successes, but also because, she was effectively one of the co-founders of the company. Beyond the sheer prowess of the design team, though, another reason Sierra titles, and in particular King's Quest and other subsequent adventure games, were so well regarded was the technology they were able to take advantage of, all of which would be codified in the company's Adventure Game Interpreter, or AGI, engine. We've talked about game engines before, but just to provide a bit of a refresher. A game engine is effectively the framework that developers create to run nearly every aspect of a game. The engine is what provides the functionality and capabilities that a game utilizes, from the types of sound files the game can play, to the graphics it can use, to the commands and interface elements available to players. Literally everything a game can do is part of the game's engine. Now, the cool thing about engines is that they can often be used for multiple games, because, like we just talked about, the engine is effectively the framework for a game to run on. This means that if you design a quality engine with certain capabilities, you can then reuse that framework to implement any number of games, whether that means simply changing the assets used from one game to the next, like modifying graphics, storylines, and sound files, to potentially enhancing that engine over time to introduce brand new and more advanced capabilities, like the ability to display more colors than earlier titles using that same engine, or giving users more commands available to navigate and explore the game's world. The perfect example of an engine that evolved over time is LucasArts' Scum engine, which we've talked about a bunch before. Originally created for Maniac Mansion, the Scum, or script creation utility for Maniac Mansion engine, became the engine LucasArts would use for nearly every adventure game released from the late 80s through the late 90s, and over time the company would continue to enhance that engine, so much so that later games made using the Scum engine were dramatically different than earlier efforts. Well, while LucasArts had their Scum engine, Sierra had their Adventure Game Interpreter, or AGI engine, and that particular technology would form the foundation of King's Quest, as well as nearly every adventure title the company would create from 1984 through 1989, with a number of enhancements made over the years to implement new capabilities for subsequent games to take advantage of. All told, 4 different major versions of the AGI engine would be created, along with a number of minor revisions with slight enhancements and bug fixes released in between those major versions. Starting with what was known internally as AGI 0 for King's Quest, and ending with the final AGI game, Manhunter 2 San Francisco in 1989, the various versions of the AGI engine would power 14 different Sierra adventure games throughout the 80s, including the initial entries in the King's Quest, Space Quest, Police Quest, and Leisure Suit Larry series. It was, for all intents and purposes, the adventure game engine, at least as far as Sierra was concerned. Despite the reliance on AGI as the adventure game engine of choice across Sierra, there was general recognition within the company that as the technology of the time continued to evolve, there would come a point in time that the AGI engine would reach the end of its useful life. I mean, sure, Sierra could technically continue to enhance the AGI engine and release new versions almost indefinitely, but with the advent of high-quality VGA graphics, brand new sound cards with both digital and synthesized music capabilities, and the mouse as the primary means of user inputs, it was pretty apparent that taking advantage of all of these new features would effectively require the majority of the AGI engine to be rewritten. Rather than do that though, Sierra took the opportunity to retire the AGI engine entirely, instead choosing to create a brand new engine from scratch that would be designed from the ground up to implement all of the modern amenities and advanced technologies that were prevalent across the computer game industry of the time. Which is why, as the AGI engine sailed off into the sunset, it would begin to be replaced by Sierra's shiny new engine, the Sierra Creative Interpreter, or SCI, in 1988. With the very first game to use that new engine being the latest entry in the King's Quest series, King's Quest IV: The Perils of Rosella. Interestingly, King's Quest IV was designed as a bridge title of sorts between the AGI and SCI engines, in that two different versions of the game were created. One used the older AGI framework, while the other used the newer SCI engine, with gamers whose machine wasn't quite powerful enough to run the SCI-based version of the title able to send their copy into Sierra to be replaced with the lower-powered AGI version of the game. While the SCI version would be the only version of King's Quest IV sold at retail stores, Sierra realized that their fan base, and in particular their King's Quest fans, always anxiously awaited a new title in the series, and they didn't want to alienate that fan base in the event that their computers weren't quite powerful enough to take advantage of the latest and greatest SCI capabilities. Which is why, like I mentioned, both AGI and SCI versions of the game were created. Despite that fact though, the focus was definitely on the SCI version of the game, and if you ever take a look at side-by-side comparison shots of the two games, you can very clearly see a number of the benefits that the new engine provided, including, for the first time in a Sierra adventure, point-and-click gameplay replacing the traditional text parser interface, as well as advanced graphical capabilities and, for those music aficionados amongst us, the ability to use the venerable Roland MT32 to play back music from the title. King's Quest was undoubtedly Sierra's flagship series, and they were ready to pull out all the stops whenever a new King's Quest was created. For King's Quest IV, the company decided to make some advances, but ultimately didn't push the envelope too far, simply because they wanted to support their entire fan base, like we just talked about, which made perfect sense in 1988. As the years continued to move on though, and as technology continued to advance, the company realized that the only way to truly continue to expand their reach was to fully take advantage of the capabilities provided by the SCI engine, and even to enhance that engine beyond the initial implementation that formed the foundation for 15 different games from 1988 to 1990. The only question was, what game could Sierra use as the showcase for all of the new capabilities they had planned, like high-quality animated character portraits, rotoscoped animations for character models, 256 color VGA graphics for every scene and object, and a full suite of digital and synthesized sounds that were intended to fully immerse gamers in the world of this future title. Well, the leadership at Sierra didn't need to think too long before they realized that a new entry in the King's Quest series, already their flagship lineup of adventure games, would make the most sense to showcase all of these new technologies to the masses. Sierra had historically used King's Quest as the flag bearer for many of their newest technologies and whiz-bang features, and the thought was, why would anyone mess with a good thing? With that realization, and with the focus of longtime King's Quest designer Roberta Williams herself, work on King's Quest V, Absence Makes the Heart Go Yonder, officially began. Creating King's Quest V progressed in largely the same way as prior King's Quest titles, with the overall story, sketches of scenes, environments, and characters, and various puzzle elements being conceptualized by Roberta Williams before eventually handing those concepts off to artists and software developers to turn them into assets usable by the SCI engine. This process, which was largely iterative and required a ton of collaboration across the entire team, was nothing new to Sierra. But, given the capabilities of the SCI engine, there was a strong desire across the entire staff to introduce new elements into the game that players had never seen before in a Quest title, very similar to Ken Williams' philosophy that formed the foundation of Online Systems' very first game, Mystery House. With $1 million budget, the team went off to turn Roberta Williams' ideas into reality, hand-drawing and painting every single background in the game before scanning them into a computer to digitize, and ultimately be integrated into the game's engine, while animators used rotoscoping to turn videotaped performances by various Sierra staff into cartoon-like animated visuals, similar to how many Disney cartoons were able to capture lifelike motions for their various animated characters. Rotoscoping, for those who may be unaware, is a process whereby pre-recorded film footage is traced and drawn over to either add additional imagery to a scene, like how Lucasfilm added lightsaber effects to early Star Wars titles, or, in the case of Disney cartoons, to turn filmed actors into cartoon characters. While rotoscoping was fairly common in film at the time, it was not widely used in the video and computer game industry, other than some landmark efforts by Jordan Mechner, like Karateka and Prince of Persia. While I'm not sure if this was the first time rotoscoping was used in an adventure title, it was, at a minimum, one of the first times an adventure game would be designed to deliver such smooth visuals and animations. While a lot of attention was placed on the visual elements of the title, equal effort was applied to every other aspect of the game, from the overall design, to the music, to the streamlining of the point-and-click gameplay that would allow users to interact with the game. Even the death sequences got a ton of attention, which, if you know Roberta Williams, might not be too much of a shock, but was still amusing to me regardless. In fact, Roberta Williams devised 40 different ways that players could potentially die in the game, an absolutely ridiculous number, even for a Sierra title. We'll talk more about my thoughts on the game's design, including the variety of deaths in the game, in just a little bit. But for now, suffice it to say that King's Quest V, in every capacity, was being designed to be a true showcase title for Sierra. Eventually, all of that work would complete, and King's Quest V would release as a floppy disk version for a variety of computer platforms, including MS-DOS, Windows, and Amiga, in November of 1990, with a CD-ROM-based enhanced edition, complete with voice acting, releasing a couple years later in 1992. Upon its release, King's Quest V would be met with significant critical acclaim, as numerous publications declared the game to be one of the best adventure games ever created, and a title that represented a new standard in the adventure game genre, with graphics, sound, and gameplay the likes of which adventure aficionados had never seen. A number of critics would name King's Quest V as the best adventure game of the year, while its proponents would continue to sing its praises for years following its release, eventually naming King's Quest V to be one of the best games ever created, period. While the game did have some critical feedback, like the design of its puzzles and, at least for the CD-ROM edition, the quality of the included voice acting, those negative critiques were few and far between. For the most part, King's Quest V was an undeniable critical success. King's Quest V would also be successful amongst Sierra's fervent fanbase, as the game would go on to sell over 500,000 copies, becoming one of the most successful titles in Sierra's entire game catalog up to that point. Interestingly though, not all gamers were thrilled with Sierra's transition to a purely point-and-click interface for the latest King's Quest title. In a survey conducted by Sierra's then quarterly magazine, Sierra News, the company asked players what they thought about the new no-typing interface, as it was referred to in that survey. Surprisingly, at least to me, 30% of respondents actually thought that the older AGI-styled text parser interface was better than this newfangled SCI-driven point-and-click interface. I don't know that I personally agree with that sentiment, though I can respect that text parser aficionados might have preferred the more open-ended and arguably more challenging text parser titles. King's Quest V would, of course, not be the last King's Quest title in the series, as Sierra would follow it up with two more traditional point-and-click adventures, as well as a 3D action-adventure hybrid that, you might have guessed, was not nearly as well received as the pure adventure titles that preceded it. The King's Quest series in general continues to be beloved amongst a large portion of the gaming population, and whether you personally prefer the old-school text-driven adventures of the 80s or the point-and-click based titles of the 90s, the simple fact is, King's Quest remains an incredibly influential and important series in gaming history. And King's Quest V, amongst the rest of the King's Quest titles Sierra worked on, is perhaps the most important release in that series. As the first true showcase point-and-click adventure title for Sierra, King's Quest V would show the gaming world what Sierra could do with advanced, for the time, technology, and would form the foundation upon which every other Sierra adventure title in the 90s would be built on. Whether you love the game and can perform a flawless Cedric impersonation, or think it had some flaws that prevent it from being a true classic, the fact is that King's Quest V remains an incredibly important release in gaming history, and as such is definitely a title that deserves to be remembered. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play King's Quest V today versus when it was released 35 years ago. King's Quest V, like we talked about, is a point-and-click adventure title, and is actually one of the first true point-and-click adventure titles Sierra Online ever created, as up to that point, Sierra had been making graphical adventures that used a combination of on-screen visuals, keyboard movement, and a text parser interface. And this general framework for Sierra's adventure titles had been pretty pervasive ever since their earliest releases, like, for instance, the original King's Quest in 1984, like we just talked about. With King's Quest V, Sierra was finally embracing true point-and-click gameplay, and as a result, King's Quest V would become the very first game in the series to utilize the control mechanics that would become common across the industry in the 1990s. Despite the fact that King's Quest V was one of the first Sierra adventures to be a point-and-click title, the general structure of the game and the way players interact with the title is surprisingly modern. Similar to how future adventure titles would evolve, King's Quest V features an icon-based system that simplifies potential player inputs to one of several different actions, including looking at items and hotspots in the game world, walking around the various screens in the game, picking an object up and or interacting with hotspots, speaking with other characters, and accessing and using inventory items. For the most part, these controls and the interaction that players can experience with the game world feels like any other point-and-click adventure title that's been released over the last 35 years, and it's a testament to Sierra's forethought and interface design prowess that the model they implemented in 1990 effectively became the standard for adventure game interface design for decades following. Also similar to other adventure titles, King's Quest V presents players with a fairly expansive world to explore, with a ton of unique screens all connected with one another to present a continuous game world that, while not exactly open world, certainly feels large enough to get lost in. It wouldn't be unheard of for someone to draw a map of the game's world, simply to help you understand where various characters, objects, and puzzles reside, and in certain sections of the game, a map almost becomes a necessity if you hope to eventually progress in the game, as there are several parts of the game that present mazes, or at a minimum, very similarly designed screens, and documenting where you've been and what exists on each screen can really help you avoid an untimely death. As you explore the game's world, you'll encounter a number of different characters, objects, creatures, and puzzles, and as you might expect given the game's pedigree, most of those characters and objects are based on fairy tale themes and lore. While I'm not sure if having a deep understanding of fairy tales and mythological creatures would really help you succeed in this particular game, it certainly wouldn't hurt. Though from my perspective, unlike earlier King's Quest titles, King's Quest V does a good job of keeping its puzzles and interactions compartmentalized within the game's design itself. Meaning, you don't need to have any real-world knowledge to beat the game. Everything you need to progress through your adventure is included, in some capacity, within the game itself, whether via object and hotspot examination or through dialogue with various characters that inhabit the game's world. And speaking of dialogue, King's Quest V is still an early enough adventure game that the concept of dialogue trees didn't really exist to any great extent, meaning when you're talking with a non-player character, all of those interactions are simply an exchange of information between you and that computer-controlled character. There's no need for players to select topics for discussion, you simply use your talk icon to speak with the character, and a conversation plays out. This particular dialogue mechanic was pretty standard for the time King's Quest V was created. What wasn't quite as standard, and was in fact a bit advanced for its time, was the inclusion of a pseudo-sidekick character, an owl named Cedric, who would accompany you for the majority of your adventure, doling out advice and providing details about the game world around you. Cedric effectively follows you from screen to screen, and you can speak with him at any point you'd like, assuming he has something pertinent to say. Otherwise, the game's narrator will simply tell you that Cedric is daydreaming about something else, or perhaps too focused on something else in the environment to have a conversation with you. And speaking of the game's narrator, pretty much anything you can examine or explore in the game is accompanied by some form of narration, which serves to enhance the overall feeling that you are in fact playing an interactive storybook. When you combine the game's visuals, all of which look hand-painted and artistically designed, with the general fairy tale themes of the game, and an ever-present narrator talking to you about what you're doing and the specific features of the world around you, you end up with an experience that really does feel like a storybook that's come to life, which I've got to say, felt pretty awesome to experience. Now, if you simply look at the framework I just described and the way King's Quest V implemented features that would become common across the entire adventure game genre in later years, you might be thinking to yourself that King's Quest V is pretty much a standard and potentially revolutionary adventure game, given all of the advances that it introduced. And in some ways, you'd be correct, in that King's Quest V was a fairly revolutionary title, and would be a harbinger of things to come as it relates to the overall structure and framework for future titles. And like I mentioned earlier, King's Quest V is designed with an interface and control mechanics that feel decidedly modern, despite the fact that the game itself is literally 35 years old. So in some ways, King's Quest V presents a timeless design that literally defines standards that countless point-and-click adventure titles would adopt in the years following its release. And for that, I absolutely respect what Sierra was able to accomplish with King's Quest V. There's just one issue. While the framework for King's Quest V from a general interface, control, and design perspective feels suitably modern, everything else about how the game was designed is decidedly old school, and in many instances, old school in the worst possible ways. Before I explain what I mean though, it's important to recognize that Sierra Online adventure titles had long been known as fairly difficult experiences where numerous deaths, dead-end paths, and convoluted puzzles were pretty much par for the course. If you pick up an older Sierra title, say from the 1980s, you can almost guarantee you're going to get a game that does not hold your hand in any way, and in fact, oftentimes relishes in the fact that it is constantly trying to kill unsuspecting players in seemingly random ways. Over time, the general design philosophy within Sierra would continue to be refined, and by the time King's Quest V was released, their adventure titles remained challenging, but started to become a bit less obtuse in terms of puzzle design and dead-end conditions. As you'd expect with any company that had spent the last 6 years working on something, the internal adventure game design skills at the company had also evolved, and with King's Quest V's arrival and the introduction of point-and-click gameplay, you'd likely expect the game to be one of the smoothest adventures Sierra had ever created, with a more refined user experience that would hopefully remove some of the frustrations of Sierra's earlier titles. Only here, you would be absolutely wrong. As for all of the things King's Quest V does right, like the visuals, music, and user interface refinements, there are also so many things that it does wrong. And unfortunately, the deficiencies with the game far outweigh the various advances that King's Quest V introduced to the adventure game genre. Before I begin my critique though, I should mention that I played the CD-ROM-based talkie version of the title, so all of my critiques are going to be based on that version of the game. Most of the time, the CD-based version of games made around this time were considered the definitive version of the experience, with better audio quality and potentially voice-acted dialogue. And yes, while King's Quest V does include some of these definitive version kinds of capabilities, as we'll see, the implementation of these capabilities is oftentimes poor, so much so that it makes the rest of the game worse as a result. Anyway, let's talk about why King's Quest V, from my perspective, is an ambitious title that fell far short of what I had hoped to see as I played the game. And listen, this one hurts me from a personal perspective, because I have fond memories of playing King's Quest V as a kid, attempting to figure out what to do, but ultimately failing to make any appreciable progress. Still, the experience at the time was captivating, and while I couldn't figure out what to do in the game, I still remember enjoying the simple act of walking around the game world and admiring its artwork and music. That experience is obviously a bit of a nostalgia-fueled memory, but I really hoped that upon revisiting the game today, I'd realize that that nostalgia was, in fact, accurate. Well, it turns out my nostalgia for this game was just thoroughly trounced, because King's Quest V, from a puzzle and game world design perspective, is not a good game. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that despite the advancements the game made in terms of adventure game technology and interfaces, the actual design of the game itself is a significant regression from Sierra's other contemporary releases. To start, let's talk about dead-end states, and how prevalent they are in the game. A dead-end state, for those who may need a refresher, is a situation where you reach a point in a game where you don't have the prerequisite knowledge or skills or items needed to progress, and you no longer have an opportunity to acquire those pieces of knowledge or skills or items, effectively ending your playthrough. In some games, dead-end states may exist, but the game's designers give you a warning that you're missing some prerequisite detail, and therefore should think twice before attempting to move forward with your adventure. In King's Quest V, however, there is no such thing, and in fact, I believe the game's designers went out of their way to create the most obtuse, infuriating set of dead-end states I may have ever seen in an adventure game. And interestingly, there are actually different types of dead-end states that could potentially end your playthrough without you knowing it, creating a situation where the design of dead-end states almost becomes an art in itself. Not only do you have situations where you fail to pick up an item that might be needed later in the game, but you also run the risk of using an item in an unanticipated way, thereby losing the item and subsequently preventing you from completing the game. You also have situations where a one-time scene plays out where if you weren't paying attention or you didn't have the appropriate item, you would never know you were supposed to do something that could literally be triggered only once in your playthrough. And if you don't realize something is amiss here, then you'll likely keep playing the game, being none the wiser, until you eventually figure out that you missed a key event and have to either restart the game or reload a prior save. Oh, and by the way, definitely save your game often here. It is almost a necessity, unless you're attempting to simply follow a walkthrough. Which, by the way, I did not do. I kind of wish I did. Anyway, the number of dead-end situations in the game is huge. And in what I thought was a particularly ironic design decision, one section of the game's world is blocked by a creature that ostensibly was meant to make it so that players wouldn't hit a dead-end state. The thought being that until you had the prerequisite item to defeat that creature, then you wouldn't be able to progress further into the game. I applaud the thought process behind that singular design decision, but then I have to ask myself, why wasn't the same thought process applied to every other ridiculous dead-end state found throughout the game? Did the development team get their jollies seeing players become frustrated by the game's poor design? Did they want to prolong the experience by making the game next to impossible to figure out short of multiple rounds of trial and error? Were the designers simply incompetent and therefore unable to design an actual functioning and fun gaming experience? I don't know the answer to those questions. All I know is I hate dead-end states, and almost more than any other game I have ever played, King's Quest V takes the concept of trapping players in unwinnable situations to a degree that borders on insanity. Equally insane, though no less frustrating, is the game's puzzle design, which can best be described as random and intensely stupid. You know how most good adventure games give you that aha feeling when you get to solve a particularly challenging puzzle? Most of the time, those games are confident enough in both their own design as well as their players' intellect to present situations that exist in the game world while also assuming that players will figure out they need to do something with those situations, often via an item that's found later that usually is the moment that makes players go, aha! This item has to be used with that thing to let me progress further in the game. I can't wait to see if I'm right. Well, King's Quest V robs players of the aha moment almost entirely, because the game explicitly telegraphs when a puzzle needs a certain item, without allowing players to come to any sort of conclusion themselves. The issue is, a good chunk of the so-called puzzles in King's Quest V won't even materialize in the game world until you pick up the item that the puzzle requires, which means there's no thinking about a given puzzle and trying to figure it out. You know when you see a certain puzzle that you have the item needed to solve it, and oftentimes it's the last item you had just picked up. To avoid spoilers, I'm going to give a hypothetical example. Assume you're wandering around the game world and pass by a waterfall. As you examine your environment, you notice that there's nothing really special about that waterfall. There's no nearby character, there's no nearby objects, no nearby hotspots. The only thing you see are some fish in the water that you can't interact with, so you assume they're just part of the environment. Otherwise, it is just a waterfall. Now, let's assume you decide there's nothing you need to do with that waterfall because there really isn't anything you can do with that waterfall. So you end up walking to the next screen, where you see a conspicuous piece of stale bread just sitting in the middle of the ground. Obviously, since this is an adventure game, you're going to pick up anything you can, so you go over to the stale bread and pick it up, adding it to your inventory. Then, let's assume you no longer want to keep going in the direction you were headed, so you turn around and head back to the waterfall screen with the intention of simply walking through the screen to head off in a different direction. Only, when you arrive at the waterfall screen, you notice that now there's a family of ducks near the waterfall, terrorizing the fish that you once thought were merely part of the environment. You realize that you literally just picked up a piece of stale bread, so you take that bread, toss it at the ducks, and they end up leaving the area. This then causes the fish near the waterfall to become interactive characters who thank you for saving them from the duck menace, and promise to help you at some point in the future. You won't know when that'll be, and you won't know it's going to happen until it actually happens. You just know you're going to get help at some random time later on. In the context of this hypothetical situation, the puzzle itself, the menacing duck family, didn't appear until you picked up the stale slice of bread, literally one screen over. Because of the timing of the pickup and the proximity of the item to the so-called puzzle, you don't really need to figure anything out, as the solution to the puzzle is telegraphed so loudly that it robs you of any sense of achievement for solving it. At one moment, it didn't exist, and then the next it did, so it obviously was tied to the item you just picked up. Talk about lazy puzzle design. The thing is, this kind of thing happens a lot in King's Quest V, so much so that a good chunk of the first portion of the game can best be described as random cause-effect puzzle design, where you pick up an item and then a puzzle spawns nearby. It is incredibly off-putting, and given the number of times it happens, pretty inexcusable from a design perspective. Beyond the poor design of the cause-effect puzzles, there are also some puzzles that make literally no sense, or at least no sense that I was able to find in the game world. I'll give you another hypothetical example. Assume you're wandering the game world and you come across a piece of rotten fruit. In real life, a piece of rotten fruit is good for only a couple things, the most prominent of which is throwing in a nearby trash can. But this is an adventure game, so you know that rotten fruit has got to be used for something. So you pick it up and add it to your inventory. Around an hour later, assume you find a magical pool, one that the game clearly suggests is the key to finding a long-lost relic that you need to find in order to succeed in your quest. You look at your inventory items and you see a couple of potential options. One, a statue of the sea god Poseidon, seems like an obvious choice, so you attempt to throw that statue into the magical pool, only the game says, no, you can't use that item here. Okay, no problem. Instead, you decide to choose a river-smooth stone from your inventory, assuming that transplanting that stone from one body of water to another might cause something interesting to happen. Only here, the game once again says, nope, can't use that item here. So you look through the rest of your inventory trying any item you have in that magical pool, only to be told time and time again that you can't use any of your items with the magical pool. Confused, you finally decide, what the heck, let's try throwing the piece of rotten fruit into the pool. To your surprise, that causes the magical pool to drain entirely, presenting an underground staircase that leads to a cavern containing the relic that you've been looking for. Now, nowhere in the game was it suggested that rotten fruit could ever have a purpose other than, being rotten fruit. There wasn't a conversation with an evil sorcerer who told you that rotten fruit concealed a hidden magical property, and there wasn't a nearby plaque that claimed true beauty is only found on the inside, or some other cryptic message that might have suggested using something rotten to get something good. Nope, none of that happened. Instead, you needed to crawl inside the crazy mind of an unskilled puzzle designer to attempt to figure out what he or she may have been thinking when they decided, seemingly at random, that rotten fruit needed to be used in a magical pool in order to progress in the game. Outside of poorly designed puzzles and dead-end situations, you know what else I don't particularly like in games? Well, if you said mazes, then you win the grand prize. Longtime listeners may recall that I've expressed my dislike of mazes several times in the past, and generally speaking, I view mazes in video games as a means of padding out an otherwise shorter experience, as opposed to being a meaningful addition to a game. So, when I discovered that King's Quest V contained not one, not two, but 3 different sections of the game that could technically be classified as maze-like, you better believe I reached for my ibuprofen in the hopes of staving off a serious migraine. Of those 3 maze-like experiences, only one is a true maze, given the fact that the maze changes how it looks depending on your perspective, and is pretty darn huge, and requires you to find a certain character before continuing, and is super confusing to navigate due to the number and types of exits from each screen. Then you have a recipe for one of the worst mazes I have ever experienced in a game. And that's not even considering the 2 other maze-like environments where you need to map out, through trial and error, the best path through a series of screens that oftentimes look identical, because they are 100% identical. Oh, and get this, as you're navigating those identical screens, you may die from exploration, which makes that trial and error mapping a bit more challenging. Or you might die from a truly random enemy appearing on the screen and killing you, just because the game decided it hates you in that one particular moment. Ooh, and speaking of random, let's say you're walking through an environment and a crazed killer might occasionally appear on a screen, which when that happens will eventually lead to an unceremonious death. Whether that crazed killer appears on the screen or not is entirely up to chance, and you may walk through a screen at one moment with no bad guy there, only to return to the screen a minute later to see death staring at you from across the screen. Let me ask you, does that degree of randomness, which is entirely unavoidable when it happens, sound like good game design to you? Well, if you said yes, then you must be part of the King's Quest V development team, in which case, my apologies for trashing a good chunk of your game's design. If you said no, though, then you're truly like the rest of us normal human beings who recognize that random deaths, truly random, unavoidable deaths, and I'm not saying where you walk into a screen and you can literally walk off the side and try to reset the whole thing. No, you are going to die. Random, unavoidable deaths in an adventure game are simply unacceptable. There is no trial and error, there is no figuring out a way to avoid the deadly creature, there is only randomness, and I've got to say, that doesn't feel all that great. There are probably at least 10 other things I really disliked about the game's design, but honestly, I'm really getting tired of being so negative. So I'm going to save some of those comments for when we talk about the more specific aspects of the game, which we're going to do in just a couple minutes. Before we get to that though, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have YouTube with gameplay videos to look up various games and see what they were like. Back then, when we made a buying decision, it was often based on word of mouth from family and friends, reviews we may have read in magazines, and what the box actually looked like in the game store. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for King's Quest V for the MS-DOS computer platform, the back of the box says, Journey into Danger. The greatest adventure in the history of Daventry is about to begin, as you embark with King Graham on the most thrilling and perilous adventure of his career, the quest for the missing royal family of Daventry. Experience the magical world of King's Quest V and discover why more people have played King's Quest than any other computer game series in history. Roberta Williams has been designing graphic adventure games since 1980, beginning with the groundbreaking Mystery House, the first computer game to combine text and graphics. She has gone on to become the best-selling interactive adventure author in the world. Her King's Quest series has sold more than 1 million copies worldwide, making it the best-selling computer adventure ever. Features a rich, complex story with highly developed characters, the most beautiful and detailed graphics ever seen in a Sierra 3D adventure game, delightful original stereo soundtrack, no typing required, a simple new interface permits complex game interactions without typed input. And then it says, here's what players are saying about King's Quest V. Congratulations on a towering achievement in storytelling. Simply the best graphics I have seen on a computer anywhere. Breathtaking backgrounds and unbelievably smooth animation. Calling King's Quest V a blockbuster is like calling Mount Everest a big rock. And then there are some screenshots on the back of the box that show the comparison between the 16 and 256 color graphics modes in the game, and I have got to say, yeah, this one sells me. I'm a sucker. I'm a sucker for point-and-click adventures. I'm a sucker for the kind of graphics and visuals that were shown on the back of the box. Roberta Williams, definitely one of the most influential game designers of all time. Yeah, I would have picked this up. I did actually buy King's Quest V, though when I bought King's Quest V when I was younger, I actually bought it as part of a CD compilation pack. I remember this fondly. I went into Electronics Boutique, and they used to have these hanging kind of CD packs where it was like 10 different CDs in a plastic sheath, or a hanging plastic sheath with all different CDs in it. And it was literally like 3 feet long or something like that, because it was the CDs kind of laid right next to each other, literally hanging on a wall. And I looked at it, and one of the games was King's Quest V, and I thought, yeah, I'm going to buy that. The font on the CD actually looked cool. It looked kind of regal. And I thought, yeah, I'm going to pick this one up. So I did, and I did play King's Quest V like I was mentioning. I never really got that far, but I do remember the Weeping Willow, and I do remember some of the music in the game. Outside of that, I really didn't remember a ton about my playing the game back when I was younger, which of course I rectified as I played it for this episode of the podcast. But yes, the King's Quest V box, it sells me. It honestly would look good on my shelf if I ever decide to buy the game. The box is good. I cannot deny that. We're going to move on to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game now, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. King's Quest V uses a painterly, hand-drawn art style for all of the game's backgrounds and environments, and I have to say, the end result is strikingly beautiful. Like I mentioned earlier, playing the game feels like a fairy tale that's come to life, and one of the primary reasons why that is because of the quality of the artwork and visuals prevalent throughout the game, which honestly look phenomenal. Were some of the backgrounds a bit pixelated and lower resolution? Sure, they were, but considering this is a game from 1990, that's entirely expected, and truly not really an issue, even when looking at the game from a more modern perspective. The quality of the visuals really do shine through here, regardless of its age, and in all sincerity, is one of my favorite aspects of the game. Animations, meanwhile, all look smooth and integrated well within the game's environments, owing largely to the fact that Sierra had taken extra time to rotoscope many of the character animations to make them appear more lifelike in the game. This is one area where the additional effort really shines through, and while the animations might not be as objectively good as the game's background scenes are, there's still a bright spot in the overall experience. Character portraits, which can occasionally appear as you're having conversations with some characters, all look pretty cool, for the most part, though I do feel that artwork isn't quite as high quality as the environmental designs that you see as you explore the game's world. It's not that the character portraits are bad, it's just that they feel a bit more dated than the rest of the game's visuals. Overall though, the visuals are one of the better aspects of the game, and I walked away being pretty impressed with what the art team was able to accomplish here. Moving on to the sound and music, the music in King's Quest V is quite good, especially if you have one of the more advanced DOS-based sound cards from around this era, like the Roland MT32, or are emulating the game and therefore emulating the audio as well. From my perspective, in addition to the graphics, the music is a definite highlight of the experience, and I loved how the various songs in the game evoked a sense of adventure and fairy tale wonder, with the Weeping Willow track being my personal favorite. Interestingly, the Weeping Willow track is the only song I had actually remembered from when I played the game as a kid, so it obviously had an impact on me, so much so that even today, it remains my favorite song in the entire game. The rest of the music is good too, with a good chunk of the music sounding like something you'd hear walking around a Renaissance fair, which is something I immensely enjoy, so you're not going to get any complaints from me as it relates to the game's music. Seriously, good stuff. Sound effects, meanwhile, are fairly minimal, but fine for what they are. No real complaints here either. Where I do have some critique, though, is the voice acting in the game, which is specific to the CD-based version of the title. If your personal favorite version of King's Quest V is the floppy version, then one of two things are true. Either you've played the CD version and decided for yourself that it's awful, in which case, yep, I'm right there with you, or perhaps you've never played the CD version before, in which case my simple advice to you is don't. Don't put yourself through that misery. Look, I think you all know that I truly hate being negative, but the CD version of the game really had a couple issues that I thought were unforgivable. For one, the voice acting. Oh my god, the voice acting. This one, I'm actually a little bit divided on, because the fact that a talkie version of the game even existed in the first place, given when the game was made and the relative newness of CD-ROM technology, means King's Quest V was ahead of its time. And it's not uncommon for early voice-acted games to feature questionable quote-unquote acting, simply because game companies weren't thinking about hiring real actors for their titles around this time. They were generally using various people from around their respective offices to act out different voices, and while some of those efforts might have been passable, others were decidedly amateur. Which brings us to King's Quest V. From my perspective, this was definitely one of the more amateur-sounding talkie adventure games I've played, and calling it amateur is being a bit generous. The acting isn't all bad, mind you, and I thought that many of the side characters in the game actually had passable voice acting, especially when you consider that most of those actors were really Sierra developers and game designers. But I've got to call out two performances in particular that made me seriously reconsider some life choices, and those would be your character, King Graham, and your mostly constant sidekick, Cedric the Owl. Graham's voice acting, as performed by Josh Mandel, can best be described as wooden and unnatural, so much so that I'd have a hard time picturing a real person sounding like Graham sounds in the game. I actually feel really bad offering this critique, because I know that Josh had previously reached out during my point-and-click podcast days to offer his support and compliments of the show, and it's entirely possible he's listening to this show right now. And if so, Josh, I'm truly sorry, but this was not your best voice work from my perspective. Cedric, meanwhile, is just downright irritating, so much so that any time he was in danger, I secretly started hoping that that would be the time when he finally bit the bullet. But no, alas, I ended up saving him time and time again, often against my will, which meant I got to listen to Cedric more and more as the game went on. Now, I should mention that Cedric's voice acting is actually not bad, and I felt like the performance actually made sense and sounded good within the context of the character and the game. And if that voice work had been used for, say, 30 seconds worth of dialogue, I would have probably called it out as one of the best performances in the game. But listening to Cedric for the entire game and his constant pestering of, "Oh, Graham, I wouldn't go in there," or "Oh, Graham, look, a poisonous snake," and "Oh, Graham, I forgot to file my taxes this year." Okay, maybe not that last one, but seriously, Cedric's voice will grate on you after a while. I don't want to belabor the point about the general quality of the voice acting, but I do have to mention one other thing, which is the fact that some of the creature voices throughout the game are incredibly difficult to understand, with the Ant King and Queen Bee being two examples where I seriously had a hard time knowing what they were saying. There was simply too much post-processing done on those voices in an attempt to make them sound different, and in doing so, the overall clarity of the speech suffered. At this point, you might be thinking to yourself, well, okay, Tony, if the voices are so bad, then why not just turn off the voices and use the text-based dialogue that was used in the floppy disk version? And to that I would say, well, because the CD version doesn't even offer the option for subtitles, which means you have to listen to all the voices in the game. Otherwise, you'll miss the entire story, as well as any clues various conversations might offer. Truly a baffling design decision. Moving on to the narrative and story, in King's Quest V, you play as King Graham, the benevolent ruler of Daventry. One day, while you're out touring your kingdom, the evil wizard Mordak shrinks your castle, along with your family inside of it, and takes it with him to Serenia, a nearby kingdom, in the hopes that his malicious act will punish you for an action previously committed by your son in a prior King's Quest title. Once you realize your castle and your family are gone, you know you have to save them. Only you don't even know where to start. Luckily, an owl by the name of Cedric witnessed Mordak capturing your family, and offers to help guide you to Serenia to assist with getting them back. Once there, you learn of Mordak's evil intentions, while also meeting Crispin, a good wizard who unfortunately needs to go off on his own adventure shortly after you arrive in Serenia. As you gather your bearings, you realize that your quest is clear. You need to infiltrate Mordak's lair, restore your castle and your family to their normal size, and somehow return to Daventry to continue overseeing the kingdom. Along the way, you'll come to help a number of different individuals, including woodland creatures, while also battling bandits, yetis, wolves, and a number of other deadly situations. Are you brave and smart enough to save your family and defeat the evil wizard Mordak? There's only one way to find out. So the story for King's Quest V is what I would consider passable, in that the overarching narrative is actually good for a fairy tale themed adventure, but is let down by the fact that other than the general story arc, the individual events that happen in the game are entirely unrelated to that arc, or at a minimum are completely disconnected from the plot. This manifests itself in puzzles and situations that are just kind of there, and whose purpose isn't made clear until well after you solve the puzzle, or gain an item that will be used later in your adventure. This seriously impacted my ability to enjoy the game and its story, because I felt like I was simply solving puzzles and talking to people just because, and there was no real purpose to many of my actions in the game. I just did them because in an adventure game, you solve puzzles. I don't know why I was solving them, I just did it. I think the story could have worked here a lot better, if it were presented in a more integrated way that made it feel less like an afterthought, but unfortunately, that's not what we got. Definitely a miss from my perspective. Moving on to the playability and controls, I already talked a ton about the general controls and playability of the title, and while I could continue bashing some of my less preferred mechanics in the game, there's really not much more to say that will further illustrate my point. The bottom line is, the controls are totally fine, and the general technology used for the game feels modern. But everything inside the game itself from an overall design perspective, from the dead-end states to the random encounters to the obtuse puzzle design to the inadvertent use of items that may in fact be needed later, thereby leading to even more dead-end states, to the number of ways you can outright die in the game, everything here is a prime example of what I dislike about certain adventure games from around this era. And King's Quest V, honestly, is one of the biggest offenders of them all. That being said, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but there is something charming here. It's just hidden under a layer of jank that makes it hard to truly enjoy the experience. Even after all of my critiques, I can still see why some individuals love the game, because despite everything, you can tell this was a labor of love. It was a totally insane Stockholm Syndrome-induced, I'm going to stalk you while you sleep kind of love, sure, but still, a bunch of individuals did try to make a worthwhile game here. I mean, King's Quest was Sierra's flagship game series, and I know they wanted to release greatness every time a new King's Quest title came out. This is tough, because while the game itself falls far short of what I'd consider to be a good experience, I still recognize and respect the efforts of those who made it. I do believe this could have been better than it was, and I do think there were some very glaring issues that should have been addressed as part of the game's overall design. But I can see what the game's designers were going for here. It just mostly missed the mark, at least for me. So what is our verdict on King's Quest V? Well, King's Quest V is a bit of a dumpster fire, but that doesn't mean there are no redeeming qualities here. The graphics look great, the music is expertly crafted, and you can see the effort the team put forth in creating the game, which I do respect. But the game itself, and most of the mechanics contained therein, are more of a mixed bag, and in many instances are downright baffling in their design and execution. Because of those reasons, as well as all of the reasons I've mentioned already, King's Quest V has just become the newest addition to our list of mediocre mentions. It's not a game entirely bereft of value or fun, despite the severity of my critiques. It's just something that you have to be in a very specific frame of mind to appreciate, or be a die-hard adventure game fan to tolerate. For everyone else, I recommend you give this one a pass. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it certainly isn't something I'd ever seek out to play again, which is why King's Quest V deserves its spot in our collection of mediocre mentions. That was our episode on King's Quest V. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on TIE Fighters, so feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on TIE Fighter. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.